Hello, friends. I'm going to talk about music here, influential music. We always talk about, when you talk about music, a lot of times it's helpful if you're describing something to someone without actually playing it for them, which is kind of what we have to do here in these realms. You try to describe music by comparing music to other bands or other musicians. Like if you like them, you probably like this. It's or something like that. But there are other bands who you talk about in terms of who they influenced. And there's these sort of ground zero from which so many other bands emanate. There's the Beatles, of course. That's the example that everybody's going to use. But when the Beatles happened, all these other bands happened after the Beatles. That happened evidently with the Sex Pistols. When the Sex Pistols played that famous show, you see those photographs and you look in the audience, and everybody in the audience is somebody famous from a band who they started the band after they saw the Sex Pistols. People say that about the Velvet Underground. That's another band that started a ripple. Whoever the creative forces in these bands were did something new and unusual, something fantastic, and influenced, and that those ripples still come out there, and you still have bands that are influenced by the Beatles, of course, the Beach Boys, the Velvet Underground, Sex Pistols, and the Ramones, and bands that started something. Now there's a band that started more than a lot of people realize. I think maybe there are people who realize this. I'm not saying that I discovered this, but there's a band called Kraftwerk. Heard of them? Of course you have. They're a German band who started out as almost like a performance art type of thing, where they would do these really sort of explorations, these kind of improvisational explorations of musical tonalities, where they were improvising and going wherever their improvisational spirits carried them. You see those early videos, you can look them up on YouTube, and they had flute and other kinds of instruments, and then you see them kind of getting into electronics. And there was a lot of bands around that time in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and that were doing these kinds of experiments. But specifically in Germany, there was a trend of bands to kind of go on this kind of a journey. And an early Kraftwerk album called Autobahn, which very distinctly takes you on a journey. That is the intent of the album. It takes you on a drive down the Autobahn, and you get that feeling of wheels turning, machines, movement, forward momentum. And that was there's a beat that you hear in a lot of those things. There's like a drum beat, this sort of repetitive drum beat that people have called it motorik, motorik, which is a type of beat that just repeats and repeats. It's not like a flashy drum fills, and it's not a groove beat. It is a very meticulous mechanical beat. Like before drum machines were being used, people were playing the drums in a way that sounded kind of machine like. And that's early days of Kraftwerk and some other bands like Can and various other bands. If you get into, they call it, I don't really like this term, but they call it krautrock, which I don't know. I feel like I'm making a slur, but that's what it's called. There are whole books with that name. I think that's the only time I'm going to say it. But it is a accepted genre, evidently, and early Kraftwerk were a part of it, along with Can and some other bands. But Kraftwerk went from that sort of improvisational, sort of meditative, almost ambient, except it had that motorik beat that sort of became this almost like a meditation, where the repetition became a kind of meditation, like a mantra repeated. And it was, I guess, the intent was to kind of put you in that trance. You know what I'm talking about. And they did it with these kind of machine like beats and these machine like sounds. There weren't a lot of there with Kraftwerk. There weren't lyrics in the early days, and there wasn't a lot of feeling of like what the song is about until they started doing until Autobahn, which was about the Autobahn, but it doesn't talk about the Autobahn in a way other than just sort of repeating that we're driving on the Autobahn. It doesn't go into any opinions about the Autobahn or anything. So it's just it is literally a song that sort of, I think, was intended to take you on a trip on the Autobahn. We're driving, driving, driving. We're going on the Autobahn. We're driving the Autobahn. And it's intense. I love that album. I still listen to it, but they got more into the electronics. Kraftwerk did. They got into taking out all the acoustic instruments. Eventually, there was other instrumentation in there, flute and things like that, that they eventually got rid of, and they went entirely into synthesizer sounds. And earlier than them, there were people who have talked about before, people who were using synthesizers to play classical music, like Wendy Carlos, who was adjusting the knobs on the computer to try to make it sound like a wind instrument, or to try to give it the tonality of a string instrument, to give it the attack, decay, release, and sustain of a violin or a percussion instrument. They're trying to make it sound like an orchestra. But then Kraftwerk decided to take those same instruments, those synthesizers, and make them sound not like acoustic instruments or real world instruments. They wanted it to not sound like a guitar or a bassoon or an oboe. They wanted it to sound like a machine, and they programmed these sounds into their synthesizers that sounded like artificially generated tonalities, which is fantastic for their early stuff, because they were doing music about machines and about mechanical processes, cars and things like that. And eventually they got to this album that I just showed you that has some really amazing songs on there. They're really great songs that I think inspired a lot of people in electronica, electronic music, electronic dance music, hip hop, certain types of beat driven music that sounds a bit minimal in some ways. It's not epic orchestra. You put this on and listen to it with your headphones, and it sounds like it's all happening right there in the speakers. It doesn't sound like you're listening to it's not in a room. It doesn't have a vast space to it. It sounds like it's all created inside your headphones. And it has a great the sound quality, the depth of the sounds. They do a great spectrum of tonalities. Like, they have their bass sounds, they have their rhythmic sounds, which are very minimal, like very almost like you're unplugging an electronic cable and plugging it back in, and it goes. It's not even. They're not even trying to make it sound like somebody hitting a drum. It is a electronic switch sound almost, and but the rhythms are incredible, and fascinatingly, the melodies are great. They did some beautiful songs. The songwriting is great. The lyrics are fun. Like "Computer Love" is a great song. "Numbers" is almost like a hip hop kind of a song. And I remember hearing that when this album came out. I remember hearing it on the radio stations that would play hip hop, and they would play Kraftwerk, which was kind of unexpected. I'd hear a Kraftwerk song, like, wow. And so Kraftwerk, I think, inspired a lot of people to start bands. You know, I think there's a lot you hear about it. People talking about their influences, bands like Depeche Mode and Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. Those early sort of synth pop bands, early '80s synth pop bands, and the later ones. You know, you hear bands like I don't know, Scritti Politti and Talk Talk and bands like that, who started out as a kind of electronica type, where they were sort of reducing what it means to be a band, taking away the big airy reverberated guitars and drums and everything, and making everything sound more contained and more electronic. They weren't trying to hide the fact that they were playing synthesizers. They were letting you know, yeah, we're playing cheap keyboards here that make this one machine-like, calculator-like sound. And that, I think, came from Kraftwerk. The sort of being proud of the simplicity and the machine likeness of the sounds, and not trying to sound like a massive rock band playing it, playing the live concert. If you see Kraftwerk playing live now, it's the four guys standing at consoles, and they're not, nobody's rocking out, nobody's coming to the edge of the stage and rocking out for you. They play the music on machines, and they're not trying to hide that from you. That's what I love about Kraftwerk. Always will. Always loved Kraftwerk. I listen to them steadily. They're on medium to high rotation here at headquarters, and I highly recommend them. I go back through their whole catalog. It's all great. There's different levels of machineness. Some of the early stuff sounds a little bit. There's a little bit of organic still kind of creeping in there. But then when they get to this point, the computer world, they have gone completely computerized, and it's fantastic. It's great stuff. Love Kraftwerk. And thanks for listening. And I will talk to you again real soon.